I've mentioned this before, but filmmaker Peter Jackson had a very weird career path. He burst onto the scene with Bad Taste, a movie about aliens coming down to Earth to abduct people to turn into fast food, and then immediately followed it up with Dead Alive, one of my absolute favorite horror movies of all time.
I kick ass for the Lord!
And from there, Peter Jackson would go on to make all of the money with Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit films, King Kong, Mortal Engines. This guy clearly had a path that was original and would never be duplicated. But what if I were to tell you there was another New Zealand-born director who was known for making low-budget horror films before branching out and getting a chance to direct films in a franchise worth billions of dollars? Because that's exactly what happened to Taika Waititi. Before going on to make Thor Ragnarok and that movie where he plays Hitler that I'm definitely going to see, Waititi directed a short film called What We Do in the Shadows, an interview with some vampires.
We are normal. We are people just like you. Except that we're undead.
It was entirely a passion project that I don't think he ever expected to get off the first run-through, but after him and a few of his colleagues got a little bit more clout and started developing more and more respected projects, they finally expanded this into a full-length film.
We drink your blood and we open your eyes.
Co-written and directed with Flight of the Conchords star Jermaine Clement, What We Do in the Shadows is a mockumentary about 4 vampires living together in a house in New Zealand. The documentary goes into detail about their everyday activities, their relationship to each other, and how they deal with living as vampires in a modern era.
Some people freak out a bit about the age difference. They think, what's this 96-year-old lady doing with a guy 4 times her age?
More importantly, the documentary follows their preparation for something that's known as the Unholy Masquerade.
On the night of the 6th of June, starting at 6 p.m., 666.
Oh, yeah.
Now, there's really not much of a streamlined plot to this movie. It's really just a day-to-day account of the vampires as they live in the house, which is where most of the humor in the movie comes from. These are fantastic creatures of the night who are doing dishes and vacuuming.
This is bullshit.
That's not to say that nothing happens in this movie, because a ton of it does. They go bar hopping, turn a man into a vampire. He brings his friend in and they all get along. A vampire hunter finds their house and tries to kill them. They all go to the vampire ball and get into a huge fight, and their friend Stu gets turned into a werewolf. So it is far from uneventful.
I've hypnotized those cops. I'm not a great hypnotizer, so it could wear off any second.
See what I'm saying?
What's that, Minnow? You're joking. Not a smoke alarm in sight.
Now, surprisingly enough, this isn't the first time a documentary was made about a group of vampires in modern-day times. There's a French film called Vampires that does the exact same thing, although from the clips I've seen of it, it's not exactly as subtle about its comedy and takes a much more reality TV vibe to it.
On couche tous entre nous, les vampires sont des très très bons coups, il faut avouer.
Unlike a few modern takes on the mockumentary format, which are just kind of done for the sake of it, this one is declared at the start of the movie to be an official documentary from the New Zealand government, which not only gives us a reason to do this style of filmmaking, but it also explains why the vampires would allow themselves to be filmed in the next few weeks.
When you're a vampire, you become very sexy.
The take on vampires in this movie don't really take a lot of liberties with traditional lore, but they play around with it enough to give you some really great situations. You can tell that this is satire done right because they clearly care about the subject that they're talking about. There have been a lot of terrible movies that try to make fun of vampires, and they are awful because they're just trying to make fun of the vampire tropes out of hatred. This movie is done out of love, which is why the references are homages and not insults.
Look, a ghost cap floating all by itself.
And a lot of it's pretty clever, like none of the vampires have reflections, so at the beginning of the film, they're trying to dress up and they use drawings and mannequins to try on clothes. I like that idea. They can't go into buildings uninvited, which obviously makes bar hopping a little complicated until they find somebody who will actually let them in. Some children are turned into vampires at an early age, so they spend their nights going after child predators and perverts, which, in and of itself, is kind of a movie I'd want to see.
You going to kill some perverts?
Yeah, we're meeting a pedophile.
Cool.
Yeah.
They're also obviously aware of modern takes on vampires, and they reference vampire movies a lot.
We stole that idea from the Lost Boys. Twilight, have you seen it? Okay, I'm the main guy, Twilight. Can't go to the ball as Blade. He's a vampire hunter.
Yeah, but vampires love Wesley Snipes, so it's
No, it's inappropriate.
One of my favorite little twists on the lore is how they treat their familiars. Familiars are humans who assist the vampires in hopes that someday they too will be turned into creatures themselves. But rather than help the vampires specifically with things related to their survival, like luring people to the house and getting blood, the familiars, especially Jackie, who they focus on, are stuck doing laundry and cleaning up after their messes and basically being treated like slaves.
My husband, he's a hemophiliac, you know, someone that bleeds a lot.
Yep.
My absolute favorite, though, is their reason for drinking virgin blood. Because they don't need to.
I think we drink virgin blood because it sounds cool.
And actually, people who are really into vampires might back me up on this one, but I'm pretty sure that's not a thing that was originally about vampires. I think it's just something that's been appropriated over time, and people assume that that's a natural thing. But when you hear this explanation, you can't really argue with it.
I think of it like this. If you were going to eat a sandwich, you would just enjoy it more if you knew no one had fucked it.
I love this movie so much.
Let us do the procession of shame now.
Shame, 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 shame.
I am fascinated, though, with how much time they spent building this world and giving it its own history as it relates to the main characters. Usually through a series of hand-painted artwork and even cave drawings showing that these vampires have been around for a very long time and have hosted some pretty killer New Year's Eve parties. And each of the characters has a clearly explained origin and also a direct reference on the way that they act and they're introduced.
Yes! Nighttime. So, now I'm going to wake up my flatmates.
Viago is your typical interview with a vampire type. He's classical, sophisticated, a bit uptight, which causes some tension with the roommates.
He was an 18th century dandy, so he can be very fussy.
You negs and negs.
I also like that he tries to make his victims feel welcome and gives them a nice night out, almost like he treats it like a date, before biting into their neck and just completely ruining it.
Well, that didn't go so great. I hit the main artery. On the upside, I think she had a really good time.
Vladislav the Poker is clearly modeled after your traditional Count Dracula, Vlad the Impaler type, especially the one from Bram Stoker's Dracula.
This is my torture chamber.
They describe his battles with a creature called the Beast and how, since he hasn't been able to overcome the creature, he's been going through a lot and his emotional state is really affecting his powers.
You should pray that you never have to see the Beast.
This one is called the Beast.
And I said, get your hands off my balls, Beast!
And they spend most of the movie building up the Beast and giving different descriptions of how dangerous and monstrous it is and how much it tormented Vlad that he couldn't overcome him. So it only makes sense when you find out that the Beast is actually Vlad's ex-girlfriend.
The Beast is the name I give to my ex-girlfriend, Pauline. She prefers Pauline.
The other vampires that we start off with are Peter, who is a Nosferatu-type vampire that lives in the basement and mostly keeps to himself. And that's pretty much it. That's the whole running joke with him.
Deacon's like the rebellious young vampire. He's always doing crazy things, saying crazy things.
Deacon they commonly refer to as the bad boy of the group, and you originally think that it's because he's the youngest of the four, even though he's still a couple hundred years old. But it turns out that's a clever way of saying he was a Nazi. And this actually surprised me because the movies I've watched up until this point have led me to believe that werewolves were Hitler's thing.
Werewolf women of the SS.
Eventually we're introduced to Nick, who is transformed early on in the movie, and we follow his immediate reactions into getting his powers and adapting to his new life. The dynamic that Nick brings to everything is pretty interesting. I think that he adds a nice flavor to it, especially because everybody else is kind of a fish out of water character stuck in their own times. and Nick brings it a little bit more closer to a modern edge. I also like the scene where he brings his friend in and basically has to come out as a vampire.
Vampire mates don't eat human mates. And no matter how much I wanted to eat him, I would never eat him because he's my mate. Hey, Stu. Yeah.
That's not really subtext so much as it is text, but it's still funny.
On transformation nights, it's all right? I'm getting stressed out.
I was just reminding you.
Stop talking and chain yourself up, you dickhead.
And all the rest of the characters are pretty good, not just the main ones. I do like how they introduce every character and how they establish the different roles that everybody plays.
Why don't you girls smell your own crotches, huh?
Come on,
What are you talking about? We don't smell our own crotches, we smell each other's crotches, and it's a form of greeting.
Werewolves hang out in packs of bros and just behave like dogs that have been transformed into humans as opposed to the other way around, which I think is really funny.
Taste this bundle of sticks. Werewolves?
Don't get it. It's not real. Nathan, it's not real.
So yeah, with all the emphasis on the jokes, it's not really something I would describe as a full-fledged horror comedy. There are definitely horror elements in it, but it's definitely more focused on the humor. There were actually 3 cuts of this movie that were made because apparently they just could not stop filming. There's a cut that's mostly story, a cut that's mostly jokes, and then a cut that's a combination of the two, which is where we got the final version. The atmosphere of everything takes a pretty big part in it, but it's always overshadowed by the jokes in pretty much every scene, so some people might find it hard to take seriously. I think the only things that are legit terrifying are the scenes where they're chasing Nick through the house when he's still human. What the fuck? Ignoring the cat face thing. And I genuinely love that effect of Deacon crawling out of the bag. There's also some great costumes and camera shots when the werewolves transform at the end. But even then, it all leads to a happy ending. There's even a truce between werewolves and vampires. So everybody makes it out alive. Except those 3 or 4 cameramen who got murdered during the full moon. Something tells me that is going to be a fine from the government to pay for that equipment.
Ooh, bad vibes!
So yeah, I absolutely love this movie. I think it's genuinely funny in so many different ways. It has great replay value, and all the characters in every situation are well fleshed out and fun as hell. The jokes are fresh despite the overused premise. The take on everything is really original, and you can tell that this was a fully developed passion project, so I'm glad that it got to be successful. The film has a surprising amount of spin-offs and tie-ins as well. Apparently there were plans to do a sequel of the movie focused entirely on the werewolves. It was either going to be called What We Do in the Moonlight or Werewolves. There's also a TV series in New Zealand based on the cops who investigate the weird unexplained instances in the film, and it's called Wellington Paranormal. I watched a few episodes, it's pretty funny. But one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk about this movie is because it came back into the public consciousness when FX put out that they were going to make a television version of this show. It's got an all-new cast and different characters, and it takes place in America instead of New Zealand. But it does feature many of the same writers and developers. And it is so good.
They didn't like the color of our skin.
Or the fact that we killed and ate people.
Probably more that.
The TV show captures everything about the original movie that made it funny, and it expands upon it. In fact, I really don't want to go into detail about it because I'm gonna make a video about it soon.
Just leave me to do my dark bidding on the internet.
What are you bidding on?
I'm bidding on the table.
For an early film of Taika Waititi's alone, this is impressive, but as a standalone piece of comedy, it's pretty remarkable how good this movie is. It's a perfect comedy even if you don't know that much about vampires or care that much about vampires, but you still want to watch a bunch of great interactions and situations. I normally have a lot more to say to wrap this up, but I don't think I really need to here. I love this movie. I think it's hysterical. Go watch it.
And voila, we are ready to go into town and party. Vampire style.
I can pretty much guarantee you this is not the last horror comedy from New Zealand that I'm going to watch for this series, but next time we're going to look at something way more serious.
Excuse me, all. Oh shit.
Why don't you let yourself? What we saying for yourself? always like to